When you think of James Bond 007, what comes to mind? For me, it's the suits, the actions, the guns, the girls, and of course, the gadgets. In this video, whilst I might be pointing out the scientific flaws with a lot of these gadgets, in my opinion, even the impossible ones added a lot to these movies. So today, we're going to look at the original James Bond movies with Sean Connery. Alright, welcome everyone. Hopefully you're going to enjoy this new format. And let's start at the beginning with Dr. No. However, before I get into the devices, I just want to make a quick note that I'm not going to cover every single James Bond gadget, or we could be here forever. As nice as I'd like that, I imagine you guys have got things to do. So, if I've missed your favourite, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll get round to it. So, the thing to note with Dr. No is it's rather unique for James Bonds. There's no real special gadgets or anything. From Dr. No, something that did catch my attention was this thing. The flamethrower tank, or the dragon tank as they call it. As you can see here, they've kind of painted an armoured vehicle as a dragon, and they're using it as a weapon here in a swamp. Now, a tank's actually not too impractical for that. As silly as a flamethrower tank like this might look, they've actually been used in history. In fact, one of the more famous ones was the Churchill crocodile, which you can see here. And they were very, very effective. In fact, the enemy soldiers would often run away rather than fight in almost every circumstance. So flamethrower tanks are quite useful, though they were normally used for attacking more enclosed targets such as bunkers and buildings. Not really open swampland, but a big armoured vehicle with big tyres, big treads, that's a pretty good idea to put in a swamp. So yeah, not too many gadgets, but very cool flamethrower tank. Alright, so let's move on to the next movie now, and the first appearance of Q. I mean, apart from having my dream job, he also introduces a lot of the gadgets that Bond is famous for. So, if we look here, in this early scene in the movie, they've got a briefcase that has about everything in it. Now, hiding money and bullets and even a knife in a briefcase, that's not too far-fetched, particularly in those days, without widespread use of metal detectors or anything. There's even a tear gas container, and that's not too unreasonable either. I am not entirely sure how it fires from there, because they don't show any mechanism, but I'm sure with a couple of magnets you'd be able to trip something in the canister. Though, one thing I do want to note, if you look at this scene, is he introduces a sniper rifle. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's wrong? It's just a fold-up sniper rifle. Those are in existence, right? Yeah, they're in existence, but it's actually the scope that I want to pay particular attention to. So if we come over to this scene here, we can see where they're actually using it. They mention that it's got an infrared scope on it. However, infrared scopes, or actually in particular they mention it's got an infrared lens. Those don't really exist. If you look at actual infrared optics, they generally need a camera and then a screen. You can't just put a filter on a lens, because even if your lens filters everything out except the infrared, you're still not going to be able to see that. Your eye can't see infrared. And let's say it was something like fluorescent, so it absorbed infrared and then gave it out as another colour. Somewhat possible, but very, very difficult to do, because most of the time, if you have a material that absorbs a wavelength and gives off another one, it shifts it further to the red. So all you're going to do is take in your infrared light and move it further away from the visible spectrum. You're not going to be able to see that. Still, taking a shot with this, that's not too bad over that distance. You're only a block away, you've got a scope. So yeah, not a bad shot. Though, you can also see that they're showing blue in this, so clearly all they've done is put a red filter over the camera footage and hope that that looks like an infrared.
She should have kept her mouth shut.
Okay, so let's move on and have a look at one of the other devices that Bond brings up, and that's in the hotel room. So you can see here he's scanning around with some little device, and he's looking for a phone tap. So he's looking for someone or a little device that'll allow someone to listen in if he makes a phone call. And he actually detects a bug and then asks for a different room. Now this device is actually really simple. All it's going to look for is a radio frequency to look for someone sending messages or sending information out. So you've tapped into the phone and it's sending off a radio signal. In fact, these are still used if you want to check a room for hidden cameras, microphones, etc. You can actually use a device like this. Alright, so now let's move on to probably what's one of the most infamous devices in this film, the shoe blade. Yes, the blade itself is not where I would have any issues. In fact, having a small spring-loaded blade in a shoe that you can release with some kind of catch, like you can see here in this scene, fairly mundane actually. I think that wouldn't be too hard to do. And if you're walking everywhere and you want to worry about security, having a hidden device like this is actually probably not that bad. As I mentioned earlier, they didn't really have widespread metal detectors, if they had any at all. So yeah, getting that through customs would have been a lot easier than carrying an actual blade. What I kind of have a bit of an issue with is the poison. Now, I'm not a biologist, but I'm almost certain that poisons don't act this fast, even if they're injected into the bloodstream. I mean, maybe if you stabbed closer to the heart or the head, the poison would reach a bit faster and cause paralysis. And they kind of make a reference in the actual movie, as you can see here.
We must invent a faster working venom.
That they want a faster acting poison. But yeah, I don't think poisons would work that way. Yes, it'd probably suffocate you. Most poisons do tend to kill through suffocation. But yeah, that's a little fast. And continuing on, let's have a look at the next device. Maybe not chronologically, but this comes up a few times. The garrote watch, or the little wire inside the watch. Now, James Bond is kind of famous for having devices in his watches, but here it's actually the Spectre agent that is famous for this device, or well known as a character for having one, and he tries to strangle James Bond, albeit unsuccessfully, of course, otherwise, well, there wouldn't be more movies than From Russia with Love. So, is this practical? Of course, it's just a wire in a watch. It's actually nothing fancy, and I'm sure with a few machine tools, you have to make this yourself at home, but I wouldn't suggest it. Don't put strangling wires in your watches. Alright, so now we move on to Goldfinger. And we gotta start with the obvious. This hat. What about the hat, you might ask? Well, if you haven't seen it, this is what the hat's for. Okay, so we see this lovely little demonstration here, decapping a statue. So, is this possible, or practical? Well, let's start with the hat design itself. It's simply, by the look of it, a metal blade on the underside of a hat. That's easy to manufacture, and it's much better than trying to conceal a gun or a knife if you're concerned about those things, and they do a bit of flying, so maybe it is. Though, would this actually make a good weapon? Well, let's compare it to a frisbee. Frisbees are pretty flat, and for a reason. You don't want air resistance. But if you got something sticking up like this, like a top hat, the air resistance is gonna slow it down, which is gonna reduce your range. Yeah, you might get a bit of momentum from the weight of the metal here, but it's not actually gonna have nearly as much power as they show it. Very cool hat though, and yes, poor odd job in the end. Though, for the most part, he did seem invincible before that bit. And so on to the next device. This tracker here. In fact, this tracker is actually smaller than the one used in Skyfall, so Q seems to have been much better here and then gotten worse in the 21st century. Though, at the time, this would have been amazing. Trackers of that size were nearly unheard of, particularly this little one here. So I have doubts about it having anything of a decent range that you could follow, because batteries in those days were also not as good. Radios don't require that much battery. Not on a small scale like this anyway. So it's possible, but yeah, I'd be questioning that range. So then we come on to one of my favorite devices of the movie. And of course it's my favorite because I like lasers. So here's the laser, big industrial laser. I've actually covered this in my original video on this channel, so check that out if you want to know more information. But Goldfinger attempts to cut James Bond in half with a laser. And in fact, you might think this is a bit far-fetched, though it's one of the better depictions of a laser in a movie. I'm actually quite happy with the accuracy here. Yes, you might not have it that far away from your target. If you look at laser cutters, they're always much closer. But the laser beam, the module, the fact that it's connected to main power and clearly takes a lot of operation. In those days, this was a new device, but that's not too far off what a laser would look like. Though, you can kind of tell how they made this scene. They've just clearly got someone with a soldering iron underneath it going along, and then they've post-edited what looks like a laser beam going across the top. Still, an awesome scene, and I love my lasers, so I love this one. Alright, and with that, let's move on to Thunderball. So let's start with this scene here, where James Bond bashes up a widow, then escapes using a jetpack. Well, jetpacks are kind of a thing, right? And yeah, maybe you get a short range out of something like this, though pretty good technology for those days. However, I almost don't need to break the physics down to show how impractical this is. Bond uses it to escape from his enemies, who by the time they pack the jetpack up, some 150 meters from where they started, the enemy's already caught them. So why he didn't just get out some other way and run for it, I don't know. Also, jetpacks, there's a reason they're not so common. Okay, so let's move on to some underwater scenes now. But let's have a look at the devices they use to get around. All these mini submarines and these seemingly underwater jet propulsion devices. I wish I had a few. I mean, they're quite simple. It's just a motor with a little propeller at the back. Keeping with the theme of underwater devices, let's look at this one next. The small breathing device that Q gives James Bond. Now, you probably would actually be able to get a few minutes out of this, like they say in the movie. However, you'd have to be careful with the concentration of the air that you put in. You might think you'd get a bit more time out of it if you just had pure oxygen compressed into the little cylinders. However, pure oxygen is toxic, which is weird because you think, oh, we need oxygen to breathe. Turns out you don't want too much of it. So normally for diving you use a mix such as heliox, which is not fully oxygen. You tend to have it a little higher than air concentration, but not too much. That might give you just enough time here without being too toxic. Okay, then let's move on to this device, the IR camera. This was used by Bond to take photos at night, and you might think from what I said earlier about the infrared lens that this thing probably wouldn't work either, but actually that's not the case. In fact, Kodak in the 1940s actually invented infrared film for uses like this, or for mainly detecting camouflaged units and personnel. And by the 1960s, it was actually fairly common. So no, this IR camera is very cool and very real. But the last one I want to look at is this homing pill, this safe radiation pill. Though, if you're talking safe radiation, then you're probably looking at the electromagnetic spectrum, because if it was something like a radioactive decay, like alpha or beta decay, it's either going to get absorbed by the body and not get anywhere and just do you damage for swallowing it, or it's not going to get very far. So you probably want something that's giving off a signal that's detectable, but I don't know any radiation source that would give off something like radio waves, which you'd need to get anywhere. And when Bond uses it, he's in this small confined cave. So I don't actually think this one is possible. For a start, even if it was giving off some signal, you wouldn't detect it outside of the cave. So Bond would not likely have been picked up because of the homing device. But it's still James Bond, so chances are someone would have come along anyway. And finally, I just want to look at this one, the skyhook here. This was an actual system, so there's not much to say here. It was actually real, even if it looks a bit far-fetched in the movies. It was a great one. I'll pop some pics up for you. Okay, now we come to You Only Live Twice, Yolt. Okay, James Bond gets one extra life than the rest of us. Let's have a look at some of the devices here. My favourite for this movie that we've definitely got to start with, Little Nelly. Alright, so let's start here with the scene where Little Nelly actually gets into some action. Is there something unrealistic about this scene? Oh, I'm sure there are. So let's have a look. So, the first device here is a flamethrower. Yeah, not very practical to actually put on a helicopter. I am not sure whether a machine gun on a small device like this would work. The kickback from the machine gun might have stability issues. However, I guess you put them on the, paper and timber aeroplanes of World War I and they survived, so I guess it would still probably work. I love the early GoPro on the head. That's got to be James Bond doing a GoPro before it was even a thing. Okay, why didn't he use the rockets earlier? Like, that's one of the first things I would have used. Particularly when they were all bunched together, I would have turned around and fired all the rockets. Oh, come on. He's got air-to-air missiles, AA missiles. Again, why would you wait until now to use them? Okay. The physics of this scene, yes, are actually not that unreasonable. Just maybe the order of battle, but that could be me. I'd do things a bit differently. Moving on. What do we get to? The X-ray desk. You're thinking, well, X-rays are a thing. You can detect bone with them, so you could detect metal like a gun or something. So what's wrong with this desk? In fact, I have no problems with the concept. What I have is a problem with the detector. In fact, there's nothing to detect. Or there's no detector, I should say. If you go for an X-ray, think about it. They always put an actual piece of film behind you. They take a photo of you. You need to have something behind to capture the X-rays. And now we come to the last thing I want to look at for this movie. This thing. This Pac-Man spaceship. Okay. This is so not practical. This is definitely what you don't want to do. And another spoiler alert, Spectre's whole job, or their whole purpose, is to start a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So what their idea for that is, steal spacecraft from both agencies, well, the USSR one and the American Space Agency, or NASA, and have them have a fight with each other. And destroy each other, and then Spectre somehow rises through the ashes and takes over the world. I mean, pretty cool story. But is this how you do it? Well, I already said it's not practical. No, you wouldn't. I mean, for one, it would actually be pretty hard to hide a launch of a spaceship that big. There's a reason that the Soviet and the American space shuttles, or not space shuttles by this point, but small capsules at least in orbit, are the size that they are. Look, they're only few-person vehicles. Whereas this thing is big enough to swallow them. So how was the launch kept a secret? Yes, they've had it near a volcano, but even by now, I think the Russians and the Americans probably would have noticed a massive rocket launch. Yes, somebody noticed something, and that's why James Bond is here in the first place, but I still have my problems with this. Also, this is not how you'd take them out. You wouldn't swallow them like this. You wouldn't capture them like that. I mean, if you were going to capture them, you'd probably actually want to tie a rope to them and bring them back down that way. It'd be much easier. Or a net. In fact, they're actually thinking of using a net to clear up space debris. So that's definitely an idea out there, and that gives you an idea of how hard it actually is to take things out of orbit this way, is that we still haven't got a proper solution. If this was actually practical, we'd be doing this by now. And we're not. Space debris is still a bit of a problem. So, let's get back to the rocket itself. It's big. And also, look at how it re-lands. This is SpaceX stuff in the 1970s. Yeah, because, of course, that technology definitely existed back then, and SpaceX, even in the 21st century, has never had problems getting their rockets to re-land properly without any issues. Well, kind of. Diamonds are forever. Well, we come to this one. The final of the Sean Connery James Bonds that I'm going to look at today. So, what do we want to start with? Well, let's have a look at this. The Pocket MI6 mousetrap. Yeah, that looks painful. Although, yeah, I just wanted to point that one out. There's actually not really any problems with the sights there. I mean, mousetraps are small, just add a slightly bigger string. Oh, sorry, not string. Spring. And some more metal to make it hurt more. So let's move on to Q's slot machine ring. And you might be looking at this going, oh, that's cool. Does it work? I don't actually know a lot about the slot machines of this time, but they were all mechanical for the most part. So the idea of interrupting them with a magnet based on Q's description, as you can see here, not too unreasonable actually. Might be something to that. And in fact, there have been some very famous frauds and tricksters in the past who actually took advantage of slot machines by making devices that would actually trick them into depositing all their money when they weren't meant to. Though those devices tended to be much longer, or often in the shape of a wand or something that you had to physically stick inside the machine to mess with it. Whether you could have a magnet in those days, particularly an adjustable one, as this looks kind of adjustable because you can set what the outcome is, I actually don't think it would be. So yes, you definitely could have a device that worked on similar principles that would interrupt a slot machine and get it to pay out early. By the way, all of today's are done electronically, so wouldn't work on any modern ones. Might work at the time, but probably not from a ring. I think you'd need something much bigger than that. You'd probably need stronger magnets. And then, of course, we have to come to the obvious device. This big diamond-powered? No, diamond reflector satellite capable of lasering targets on the ground. This is kind of the whole plot of Die Another Day and the whole Icarus program, just with Sean Connery and graphics that weren't quite like the later James Bond. So, is this thing practical? Well, if you've seen my other video on Project Excalibur and trying to make space-based lasers, there's probably a couple of issues I have here. One, if you're going to make it into a weapon, you probably wouldn't use visible wavelength like this. You wouldn't use a red laser. You'd probably do infrared at best if you want to heat your objects up and blow them up like this. But also, what are the diamonds for? Okay, they kind of make it look like it's a focusing device or a reflector of some kind, and I understand why they might want to use diamonds. Obviously, if this thing is producing the amount of energy that they're trying to depict it is, it's going to generate a lot of heat. And that's going to destroy most objects, so you probably wanted diamonds as an idea because they're not going to melt, they're not going to get destroyed. But diamonds, as they show here, all the diamonds they collect have all been cut into their nice little crystal-like shapes. They're not going to reflect the light evenly. It's going to go off in all sorts of directions. You're not going to be able to use these like a lens because if you look at a lens like this one, it's smooth. These diamonds are jagged and rough. Pretty, but certainly not how you would focus a laser beam. Also, yeah, even if you're reflecting heat, no. There we go, everyone. Something a bit different today. Hopefully you all enjoyed this as much as I did. And maybe you got something out of it, or maybe you've even thought about something that I've missed, and don't forget to tell me in the comments. Remember, I'm almost a doctor, and until next time, be like a proton. Stay positive.